Sabrina 90s comic issue 18. We start out seeing Harvey, as a lifeguard, welcome Sabrina to the community pool. Sabrina asks him if he saved any lives today, and then a girl shows up for her daily practice session and he agrees to keep an eye on her. I guess Sabrina will get jealous. And she does. It turns out Sheila's the state swimming champ. Why is he saying of course? That wasn't obvious. Sabrina takes off and warps home, and she tells Salem that she even wore a new suit to the pool and Harvey didn't care. I mean, she can't expect all of the girls that he's supervising as a lifeguard to be ugly. Salem points out that Sabrina can swim as well. He says that he smells trouble when Sabrina gets the idea to cheat by magically making herself a better swimmer than Sheila to get Harvey's attention back. As long as it's only for Harvey's attention and not for sports, it's not a big deal because it'll involve so few people. Sabrina uses a spell to make herself able to swim with the grace of a fish, and it turns out the spell was being literal and she was turned into a fish the size of Salem. And she's surprised by this. I guess her magic got confused because she insisted on saying the word fish, so she of course imagined fish, so she would picture fish swimming. Still, it's weird that her own magic, which should know what her brain wants, would think she wants to become a fish when she doesn't. There's a big difference between that and her wanting to swim better as a human, which would be visualized very differently. You'd think she would know better. So the story seems stupidly arbitrary so far. At least there's enough logic that she needs water. Salem gives her a jar of water and says that she looks good enough to eat. Good thing for Sabrina, she can still talk because she'd want to despite being a fish. And yet, her powers don't work when she's a fish, when she wouldn't have wanted that. That's dumb. The fish she'd be thinking about when saying that spell probably wouldn't be able to talk because why would you think about a talking fish? So she's lucky. This would make more sense if she bumped into a witch on the street, or Esmeralda got mad at her and turned her into fish out of spite. Because Sabrina's aunts are out shopping, Salem goes to find them, rolling the jar of water on the ground, and Sabrina gets dizzy, logically. Of course they run into trouble on the way. She didn't picture a fish that can use magic, but she also didn't picture a fish that could talk. Salem taunts the dog who's fenced in. Wait, the fence doesn't even look like it's on any side but one. Shouldn't the dog be able to go around the fence? It looks like it should be able to go take a few steps to the left and go after Salem. Because Salem let go of the jar and taunted the jar rolls down the hill because he didn't realize they were on top of one, even though he should have noticed that he was walking up a hill. That wouldn't happen. I was expecting Salem to walk past some humans, and they'd pick up him and the jar instead of minding their own business and kidnap them. Instead, the jar breaks on the bridge. Well, I'm excited for the rest of the story, even if its premise was kind of botched. There really was nowhere to go for the plot if Sabrina achieved her actual goal, as long as she didn't try to become a professional swimmer and feel guilty. But that didn't need to be the whole premise. It could just be something she did to impress Harvey, and then the story could have been about something else. Conveniently, the second that Sabrina falls in the river, Hilda and Zelda walk by on the bridge and meet Salem holding groceries. Why are they walking on a bridge? Why were they walking home? Wouldn't they warp home as soon as... I guess they keep walking until they're certain that no mortals are around them to witness them warping home. But then shouldn't a mortal be witnessing Salem talking to them? It was nice of Salem to admit that Sabrina is his best friend. I'm really glad that the story cut past Salem recapping to the ants why Sabrina turned herself into a fish. Rick and Morty justified this kind of thing better, because Morty thought it'd be cool to turn into a fish because of Sword in the Stone. So he got Rick to do that for him. Sabrina fights against a current pulling her downstream, and then ducks into a cave for safety. It seems so unlikely that Sabrina turned herself into a fully red fish. Whenever I think of a fish, I think of a light blue or green one. Somehow the fish she thought of was a red one? It would have made sense if the last thing she saw was a red herring. She has to avoid a giant fish because she mistook its mouth for a cave. How is she talking underwater? Wouldn't she be gurgling instead? We're even seeing bubbles coming out of her mouth. So it's not like she's not talking with her mouth. But since she's already able to talk as a fish, I have to assume she's not talking in a scientific way like a person would. She thinks she's talking normally because it's force of habit, but her mouth is moving, but it's not really where the voice is coming from. For example, you need teeth to talk normally, and most fish don't have teeth. It's probably more like her human soul is producing the human speech because of her magic. Like telepathy. Well, it wouldn't be so confusing if it was a thought bubble instead of a normal bubble. Then Sabrina sees a submarine, which is yellow for the sake of a reference. Zelda's looking for Sabrina in it. I assumed that she would stare into a crystal ball and try to locate Sabrina with scrying, so that she could see her and warp her home. But this is a more direct approach, which is logical. Hilda stares at a fish with freckles peeking in the periscope, and Salem immediately says that's her without looking at it himself. Why would Sabrina have freckles as a fish, if she didn't intend to turn herself into a fish? So the fish she would have imagined wouldn't have had freckles. Shouldn't Salem have told Hilda what Sabrina looked like as a fish so she'd know it was her on sight? That was obvious. Hilda warped Sabrina into a goldfish bowl, and because it was jealousy that made her turn herself into a fish, even though it was an accident, it'll take a kiss from Harvey to turn her back to normal. Translation, the writer got high. They could have easily had her be turned back to normal here, and then the rest of the plot could be about something else. It's not an action series, so its plot doesn't need to force tension for a long time. It would make more sense if it turned out her aunts were lying to her to punish her for being too jealous of a girlfriend, when really they could just turn her back to normal whenever they want. I would understand that because she needs to learn the lesson that she can't be too jealous to be a healthy girlfriend. The only reason Sabrina's ever going to turn back to normal after this is that, well, one, Zelda and Hilda could easily magically brainwash Harvey into kissing her. Maybe the council assumes most witches wouldn't have another witch to get around to this punishment for them because they're quick to jealousy, so they're less likely to have friends. Beyond brainwashing, the only reason Sabrina's going to turn back to normal is that Harvey's such a nice guy that he can be talked into doing almost anything by his loved ones. I guess the requirement is to make sure that the person is actually loved by their lover. Zelda tells Harvey, who rushed over here from a call from Sabrina, that her fish needs mouth-to-mouth. Despite Harvey being smart enough to say that fish don't need CPR, he's easily peer pressured into doing it anyways. Good thing. I guess it's to demonstrate how much he'd do anything for Sabrina, but he should say that. Sabrina turns back to normal and he passes out as I wonder if I've read this story before in Archie. It seemed familiar, especially when she tells Harvey that there was no fish and he ran in and kissed her. I definitely have this story. Harvey says that he's been getting too much sun at the pool. Salem then decides to mess with him by saying, "Yeah, next thing you know you'll think I'm talking to you." And I giggled when he ran away in the panic. And Sabrina glares at Salem while he says, "Well, we did have to make it convincing, didn't we?" There's no way a mere mortal would be able to run through the wall. It'd be ridiculous to say Harvey wasn't mortal. So it's gotta be that the wall is made of flimsy material, for some reason. And Harvey was too panicked to question it. I guess the house is just that old. The next story starts with Salem happy to get out of the house for a while and walk around the city alone, thinking, every cat can use a witch-free afternoon now and then. It's making me smile. It's funny because most cats aren't around witches. Then he hears a bank alarm and assumes a holdup is going on. I guess he's making a mistake because this is a light-hearted comic and him making a mistake would be a joke. So he jumps into a random car for safety. And it turns out that while he was right about his assumption, he got into the robber's getaway car. Lefty tells Tiny to put the bag of money on the back seat and cover it with a blanket until they get to their hideout. I hope those are just nicknames they call themselves, because who would name their kid names like that? Maybe that's why they turned out the way they did. Tiny shows a soft side as he's happy about seeing Salem and asks to keep him, and his boss decides to humor him because they don't have time to find him another home. The robbers picked the warehouse where the cops stored their confiscated goods and spare equipment as their hideout because it's the last place in town they'd expect to find bank robbers on the run. They decide to get some sleep in sleeping bags before they'd head for State Line before dawn. Salem wants to find some way to contact the police, but he doesn't think there's a phone in here. Then he finds a radio because of where he is, so he plugs it in, planning to call for help on the police frequency. I'm guessing it won't be that simple. I mean, how close is he to these guys? He'd wake them up. How did Tiny immediately start snoring? Conveniently, they don't hear him right beside them. Salem wonders if he could use a cap, jacket, spotlight, and megaphone to his advantage. Oh, the criminals only see his silhouette. He says that he's a cop and tells them to come out of the warehouse before the police come after them. They panic and leave, and get arrested. Then the cop that's a woman for variety's sake sees an address on Salem's collar, which explains how he gets home to Sabrina so fast. It was interesting to see a story about Salem for a change, and while I was worried it'd be boring with no magic, I'm glad it wasn't. Then there's a comedy page where Hilda complains that the seats Sabrina got her for the circus are lousy because they can hardly see what's going on. Sabrina casts a spell to get the best seats ever, only to end up on the trapeze being yelled at, which couldn't have been what she was imagining. So that was dumb. How would her magic do that when she doesn't want it to? In the next story, we see Sabrina and Esmeralda at the beach, with Esmeralda complaining about the mortals being around. Lucky for her, no one's turning their heads to look at her after she says this stuff, for some weird reason. Is the beach that loud? Sabrina says that the crowd makes for more fun things to do. Esmeralda asks, like what? Counting chubby guys in flowered shorts? Sabrina points out a sandcastle contest. Predictably, Esmeralda uses magic to make a special sandcastle. Then she shrinks her and Sabrina down, presumably right in front of mortals, and Sabrina barely avoids getting stepped on. It's nice of Sabrina to humor Esmeralda and agree to try to go into the castle anyways. I would have expected her to immediately tell her to get rid of the castle before a mortal sees. Esmeralda tells her to take the straw and pole vault over the moat. Then Esmeralda reveals that she has snapping turtles in it. That was unnecessary. They walk past some knight's armor, and she shows Sabrina a bank vault of sand, and the bedrooms have water beds, and there's a dogfish in one of them. At least she's got a great imagination. She tells Sabrina they're going to be jousting with cotton swabs on crabs, and hits her with one. Sabrina says that she's getting hot and could use something to cool off. Then she blames her when she gets wet, but it turns out it's just a tide coming in. So they use magic to return to normal size just as the sandcastle gets destroyed. And the story ends with Sabrina being drawn to faint in a confusing exaggerated reaction to her zapped up tiny flood insurance policy. The first story was by Bill Gallagher, and was about Sabrina turning herself into a fish by accident because she read out a spell to make herself swim as well as a fish, when she could have easily used a spell that didn't have the word fish in it. And she ends up in the river because somehow Salem didn't realize he was on top of a hill, and her jar rolled down into it. So Zelda has to find her in a submarine after Salem conveniently saw her walk up to him on the way home with the groceries, instead of her simply warping home herself. It's not like Sabrina has to say spells to use magic. I guess she figured learning how to swim would be so complicated that she'd need to say a spell. But she could have used the magic book and used a proper spell for that. Sabrina's saved, and then the bullshit comes in because Harvey needs to be talked into kissing her to bring her back to normal for some reason. That's such a confusing part of the story that's forgettable. I wish it was explained that the Witches' Council cast a powerful spell to make this the case for jealousy spells out of spite, to teach witches a lesson about abusing magic because of jealousy. Because there's no way that this is how magic would work from the start. She could have turned back to normal herself by pointing her fins at herself, and the whole story could have been about something else afterwards. Or been shorter. Why would her magic think she didn't want to have her powers as a fish, and yet still kept her ability to talk? So she was like a fish, but not really. That story was just too arbitrary. I'm glad she was rolled around in a jar of water before the story got more predictable with that river. The second story is about Salem getting kidnapped by bank robbers because he jumped into a car when a bank alarm went off to hide like a coward for no reason, when he should have known he wouldn't be threatened. He should have just ran away. And he calls the police and makes his silhouette look like a human with a disguise to trick them into going out of the warehouse and getting arrested. I hate that the criminals somehow didn't hear him on the radio right beside them, instantly after they laid down. He should have been ready to go plug the radio in further away. But at the end of the day, it was still an interesting story, even without magic being used in it. It took advantage of Salem looking like a cat because the bank robber was nice to him and didn't suspect him. The final story is about Sabrina's cousin Esmeralda showing off her imaginative sandcastle that they get shrunken to explore. It was interesting to see all the variety and all the things she showed her, and how she used cotton swabs as jousting lances and crabs as horses because they were small. It was surprisingly smart and subtle of her to have her castle be tiny instead of gigantic and drawing attention. Because I would imagine her to want to make the castle gigantic, because she always likes showing off the fact that she's a witch. Instead, it seems like she learned from her experiences with Sabrina, and knew that she wouldn't be able to get away with that.